Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Non-Toxic Environments. This is your host, Andy Pace. This week is another great show. I am speaking with Sarah Mack with Enthalpy Analytical. Enthalpy is the manufacturer and the lab for the home air check test systems. And I've been working with them, for many, many years now. These kits are able to measure VOCs, formaldehyde, and active mold. They're an invaluable asset, giving us here quick and accurate numbers at a very affordable price. And so I'm just excited to have Sarah on the show today to discuss these kits and then what else is on the testing horizon at Enthalpy.
This is the company that years ago developed the home air check system, and I've been working with them for years, and we offer it through our website. There's other companies around the country that also offer this. But it's been an absolutely invaluable service for our clients who are looking for ways to get baseline numbers in a house, doing a remodeling project, or they are buying a home or have bought a home and they need to know what's going on. It's a really, really accurate and I think quick and easy way to get those numbers and give us something to work with. So with that, Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to speak to this community and this group. As you know, we deal with a lot of clients that are dealing with similar issues and concerns. And so you're a large part of our network of clients for certain.
Sarah, how long ago was this system developed?
So kind of the history and the backstory to the laboratory itself, it kind of initiated back in 1992 with some soil and water testing. That transitioned in 95 to add in some air quality testing. And in about 2010, we rolled out, previously doing the air quality testing, we were working primarily with indoor air consultants and industrial hygienists for workplace exposures, much less so for the residential space. And so in 2010, we actually developed a simpler process and simpler analysis to be able to roll that out to home inspectors and the like in terms of people that are going into the residences to be able to get quality indoor air quality data, that they can use. And so in 2010, we kind of rolled out our home air check professional, which was to the inspectors. And in about 2012, I think we were live with our home air check website where we saw the need for a direct do-it-yourself easy kit because we didn't have professionals in a number of the areas where people were asking for this service.
Yeah, and I think that from our standpoint, and I think everybody would feel the same way, it's like you need to do mold testing, formaldehyde testing, VOC testing, and if you have a indoor air quality scientist in your area that can do these tests, even if you do have that, you're looking at sometimes thousands of dollars to do that, and this is a way to get into that for kind of a fraction of that. And the information that's derived from the testing is incredibly accurate.
It is. So when we think of the indoor air quality and the environment itself, of course, that includes even temperature, humidity, the particulates that are present in the space, other chemicals such as CO, CO2. This is a quick an easy way to rule out a large number of things that could be wrong in the indoor air quality space. And so with that, like you say, it's a good first check. So it looks for the chemical components that would be present in the air. We look for actively growing mold. And then the formaldehyde kit itself, those are going to be a very irritant-like chemical compound that happens, as you know, with a lot of reconstruction or new construction. And so with that VOC test, it includes the mold VOCs, and that formaldehyde being added on covers, I would say, a good 70% of what could be bothering someone in an indoor air space.
Sure. And for us, it's been invaluable. I can't tell you how often we've been in these situations where customers have called and said they're facing these certain issues in the home, and the first thing I ask them is, well, do we have any baseline numbers, what we're actually seeing in the field? And so we'll have a test kit set out, the reports come back, and we can find they're really high in specific types of VOCs, and we just know through not only what you provide information-wise, but also just our own knowledge base that there are certain things that give off those types of VOCs, so we kind of know what direction now to go to when we're looking to fix the issue. And so I don't even know where to begin on that one. It's just like with VOCs and formaldehyde specifically. Formaldehyde for me and for most of our clients is that key trigger. That's the one that we try to avoid. That's the one that for us, if it's above 20 parts per billion, we're now looking for what's the problem. And it's like I said, it's just been incredibly helpful for us. We actually use your system. And then if we do find that there's a specific formaldehyde problem in a home, if we can't troubleshoot it just based upon the discussion we have with the clients and maybe pictures or video, what have you, because we work with clients all over the country, we also then do what's called a FRAT test, which is a formaldehyde release attenuation test, where we can actually test specific surfaces of the home, and it's accurate down to 1 part per billion formaldehyde released from those surfaces. So the two tests combined have been really fantastic.
Yeah. So again, kind of, I know one of the questions kind of coming into it was, what's the difference between like an instant read monitor that gives you kind of a whole or total VOC, and then our reports kind of there then in that middle where we start to break down what those VOCs are, and like you said, where they're coming from with the contamination index, so that it isn't just, hey, I'm high and now I've got to do something about it. It helps you to kind of double whammy it, I suppose, where you're actually looking for the sources, you're removing those sources, which is similar to that formaldehyde instrument that you're speaking about, is that you can go, yes, we might have 5 different sources of formaldehyde inside of that space, but then you can look and see which one is creating maybe more or could be of bigger concern to remedy first.
So we had a situation about a year ago where a client used the test system and the VOC spiked. I mean, it was incredibly high. And this is, of course, after a customer had already done just a bunch of remodeling in their home to make it healthier. And again, this is why I love working with your system, is that it allows me then as the professional to start asking questions to the customer. Now, it was determined after lots of back and forth that the reason why the VOC spiked is because he happened to be a diabetic, and during the testing that was done, he didn't even think about this. He did an insulin injection, and he wiped that spot on his skin with an alcohol pad, spiked the meter.
Mm-hmm. And so when we get into some of those details, we're not getting just a total VOC where it's spiked high, but we can see, if you've got a high concentration and over half of it's just that alcohol, that rubbing alcohol, then you have an indication of kind of what's going on. But if a lot of it's maybe in the painting, then that might be something a little bit different that you have to address.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right. And so that's why I love that system. And so many clients over the years have purchased their own VOC meters and other air monitoring devices. But when you don't get that additional information, I think it's even more dangerous than having it all, because now you have people running to these extremes to try to fix something in their home that really isn't a problem. It just happened to be at that exact time that you looked at the monitor, something else was going on in the home. And if you don't have that breakdown of detail, it can be, lead to a lot of unwanted expense.
It can. One of the biggest things I do feel like those instant meters that give you kind of that total up and down trending for your VOC concentration, they're certainly helpful in identifying activities, things that you're doing in this space, to see how and when those VOC spikes are coming. So when you're doing a thorough cleaning, when you're showering in the morning, when you're cooking in the evening, those types of things you typically would then see as trends back and forth. And it's, if you come up and stay really, really high, then that typically is an indication of poor ventilation. And so there's some things that you can really glean from those that have more of a long-term detection or total. But like you said, if you have some of those spikes, unfortunately, you don't know what they're from unless you really start to journal. And I'm a big person in regarding to journaling and kind of what activities you're doing in the space when you see those meters up and down. See, and if you can identify them.
For sure. And so this is where it becomes a little more crucial as far as where you place the system. And now for those people who aren't interested in the home air check system, it essentially contains when you buy the kits or you buy the test, you are going to get in the mail a box that contains an air pump and a series of tubes to actually collect what's in the air. So it's a very small system, but it has to be placed in an area in the room essentially that allows for good airflow. Get it away from corners. You want to make sure you're putting it in an area that's, I would say, common, so that whatever you find from a particulate or VOC standpoint is what you are seeing on a daily basis. What do you think about HVAC systems? Do you want those running while the test is being done, or does it matter?
So typically we would indicate yes to maintain that running in the normal operation. So the VOCs, chemically speaking, that's going to help to intermix those. So that's why typically we can do one test kind of in a central location of the house, covering a good 2,000 square feet or so, because those chemicals are going to become intermixed within the air in the spaces. Sure, you'll have some spikes in certain rooms, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty mixed. If you don't run it on a regular basis, that's your normal. So it wouldn't be on, but it really is whatever it's in a science experiment, right? So whatever the variables that you want to control. If you have an HVAC system with some type of an air filter or purification system in it, and you want to know if that goes down, what's your exposure, you would turn off that HVAC system to see, and what is our peak, or how high do we get if that were to go down, or if we were to shut it off. And so the data is dependent on the variables that you want to look at. And so usually we say keep it like you normally would, what you're being exposed to on a day-to-day basis. But there are certain instances where clients are looking for a slightly different reason for the data.
Sure. Well, that really plays into the whole, garbage in, garbage out mentality. If you're not conducting the test in and keeping track of what's happening, or where you're doing it, or the temperature, the humidity, and then whether the AC is on or not, that can really, again, cause people to jump to conclusions because maybe something happened that you just weren't expecting. And so this is what I have an issue with when people buy their own handheld monitors, and they walk around the house and they see these, again, VOC spikes or what have you, but they don't look at it logically to say, what happened in the house in the last 20 minutes, the last hour? Is this hour after everybody in the house showered and put on hairspray and made breakfast, and then they left? And has the home had a chance to kind of clean itself up a little bit before you conducted the test? And so these things, we try to point that out with every client, that you really want to make sure that, like after cooking breakfast, how long would you say after cooking a meal you should wait before you even start doing the test?
Well, I know in my house, if you cook some bacon, it's going to smell like it for a while, right? So depending on the situation, depending on the space, those are little and minor in the grand scheme of things. It's not like you're cooking bacon every morning. I mean, maybe some are, but so those are going to be the large amounts, but we will see a spike. And so as you know, looking at the data, when it comes on the backside, there's questions that we then start to have to say, was this something that was happening at that time? And the context of how the sample was collected is important. Being absolutely open and forward, trying to remember as best as possible. I think that's the biggest thing I can tell people that are looking to do any indoor air quality testing that's chemical specific is be mindful of the surroundings, because we're going to ask those questions, and we typically can connect the dots. Like you said, it may take a little bit longer of a conversation with a number of things kind of pulling out, what additional items could be causing those chemical compounds. Because if we look at like acetone, for instance, I mean, that's one chemical compound. It's found in so many different things. So we start with some of the more common ones, and then we work our way down that list. And knowing and understanding kind of what's happening in the space is going to be beneficial and helpful to really pinpointing that in a faster way.
So that brings up another question I have, because I've been talking about this for years. When the VOC regulations came out in the mid to late 90s, and all the paint manufacturers and the coatings and adhesive manufacturers started lowering and eliminating VOCs, what most people don't know is that they only have to limit the VOCs that are regulated by the EPA. So there, even though there's hundreds of VOCs that are found in traditional building materials, there's a list of about 35 to 45 VOCs that are considered unregulated by the EPA because they don't actually create low-level smog. Mm-hmm. And a few of these are very, very common, specifically in zero VOC paints: acetone, ammonia, and butyl acetate. And we know these chemicals are dangerous for humans, but they don't actually react with nitrogen and UV to create low-level smog. So the EPA said, all right, it's unregulated, you can use it, and you don't have to put it on your MSDS sheets. How does your test, does the test system sort of discern this? Or when you're testing VOCs, how would an unregulated VOC come up on the test result?
See, that's the beauty of it, is we're looking for hundreds of different chemical compounds. That is a common misconception, unfortunately, with the no or the low or zero VOC paints. I mean, it's still a chemical, mm-hmm. right? I mean, in all honesty, water is a chemical. Mm-hmm. So it's still a chemical molecule that's going to release VOCs. It's a matter of how fast it releases those and what they are then. A lot of the times, the paint manufacturers can't get rid of the specific things that really make it paint. So when we start getting up into higher range carbons is actually what it boils down to. We'll still see those, but then we'll see a little bit of a difference in some of the other chemical compounds that are present, but they still have the same basic use or purpose. Mm-hmm. And so we still see kind of on the backside what those are and can attribute those to a paint range type product.
And I think that's very important because, again, most people, when they look at the spec sheets for a zero VOC paint, and they say, all right, zero VOC, I'm good. And they don't understand the fact that, again, first, VOCs are not regulated because of direct human health concern. They're regulated because of outdoor air pollution. It is true, many VOCs are also very harmful to humans. It's also true that many VOCs are completely harmless to humans. And so when you paint them all with that same broad brush, this is what causes confusion. And so if you look at the spec sheets for a off-the-shelf zero VOC paint, and it says 0 grams per liter, it usually has a little caveat that says, according to the EPA test method 24, which eliminates all of those unregulated VOCs. Mm-hmm. And when you do a home air check test, you kind of see it all. You see everything, and then it's broken down into subcategories of what it actually is.
We see those alternatives that are used typically. And so there's a number of them that we see quite frequently. And we've done our research, right? Over the years, we've had employees and or clients that have specifically stated that they used a low or a no VOC paint. And so we kind of have built up the triggers or the certain compounds that would be identified when a low or no VOC paint is used. So those alternatives that they're putting in there. Texanol A and B are some of those that we see on a quite regular basis for a low or no VOC paint. And that's where it's kind of an indication for us that was used.
Very good. Very good. And so I think that just, it really speaks to how important it is if you are experiencing, specifically if you're experiencing health issues in a home after remodeling's been done, you can tell yourself that, well, I used low or zero VOC products, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're safe for the occupants. And I've been hearing this for years. I remember back in 1998, I believe, or 99, when Glidden was the first paint company to come out with zero VOC paints. Environmental Building News did a whole story on how they were still getting not only high VOCs, but high formaldehyde coming off of that product. And then they tested a host of other zero VOC products. And they said most of them still have VOCs and formaldehyde. And that's because this is what they were doing. They're hiding the regulated by using unregulated. And there's also these formaldehyde derivatives or formaldehyde donors that are used that aren't found in the ingredients list. But once the paint starts to cure on the wall, formaldehyde is created. And so using your system, you will find that. And it's been very, very important for us.
One thing Alice, the lab director, had said years ago, essentially when we were talking about low or no VOC paints versus standard paint, it always comes back to the individual person. If they're specifically chemically sensitive to some of those naughty list from the EPA, right? Then you might want to make sure that you're handling that appropriately. One of the trade-offs, unfortunately, with some of the alternative paints, as they change the structure or the makeup of the paint itself, is you lose something, right? There was a reason why they had those certain things included. You start to lose longevity, sheen, a number of different things with that. And a lot of the paints range compounds are almost semi-volatile. So they off gas at a much higher temperature, essentially. With that, at the lower temperatures, you'll get a smaller amount for a much longer period of time. Where if you painted, maybe say with regular paint, sometimes if your body or your person, your family can manage that with proper ventilation and doing all the things you're supposed to, it might be better to use something maybe regular to get that off gassing out quicker. So it's a toss up between who you are, what your body can handle, a lot of different things.
Right. And boy, you said a couple of things there that just jumped out at me. First, this is the reason why I don't recommend customers doing bakeouts in their house. I read articles from 15 years ago debunking the whole bakeout process, saying that you actually start to release these semi-volatiles and you create new chemical compounds in the air that would never exist unless you heat it up to a certain temperature. And then, of course, the other thing is that I can then argue that some of the older paints were healthier because they didn't have to use all these exotic ingredients in order to skirt around the EPA regulations.
Unfortunately, but yes, so very true.
So let's kind of shift topics a little bit and talk about mold. This is an absolutely enormous topic in all of my consultations now. In the last 3 or 4 years, mold went from maybe 1 in 10 people talking about to 6 or 7 in 10 that I talk to on a daily basis brings out mold in that conversation. I think the reason is because in the last few years, because of the pandemic, people being stuck inside their homes more than they used to be, really had brought out more of these questions. And I believe there's just more talk about it now because there's more information around. How does the home air check system help in testing for mold? And give us some information on that, please.
Sure. So there's a number of different ways to actually look for mold. So I do want to make sure that that's clear. Typically, the most common would be actually to look for spores. So those are going to be the particles that come from the mold as it's disturbed. Those are going to be the things that people, almost that allergen or histamine type reaction that happens, would be exposed to. The spores are what we ingest if we have moldy foods and things like that. What we look for in our VOC test, because we're not doing particulates specifically with our chemical analysis, what we're looking for is that as molds are actively growing, they have to have a water, heat, and digestive source, right? They have to have something that they can intake. So with that, when they have those 3 things and are actively growing, we get that smell. We get those odors and the chemicals that come off. And so what we essentially are looking for with the home air check kit is what is considered mold VOCs. So that would be, it sounds silly, but I liken it to mold burps. So as it's digesting the surface, it's emitting certain chemical compounds as part of that digestive process. And so that's what we typically look for. Now, you can also look for mycotoxins. Mycotoxins is a whole other kind of beast. This isn't that. So there is some differences there. But with the mold VOCs, you can get an elevated mold VOC and not see spores in a spore count. Essentially, that would be typically an indication that it's probably behind wall, ceiling, floor, something where those particles can't necessarily move through yet, but that there is some type of a mold growth process happening behind that wall cavity. So it's an indication of actively growing mold. It can be kind of a first test or look to see if you've got something going on. It is not an end all. If you do suspect mold and or if you see mold, we certainly won't be needed. I mean, if you see mold, then we want to remedy that. Our test doesn't necessarily help a whole lot, but it is kind of a first look. If you're unsure of what's happening in the space, we can at least see if there's some active mold growth happening.
So then how this differs then from doing like an ERMI test?
It does. Yep. The ERMI test is going to be that collection of actual dust, right, from the space. That looks for the species and types. I think it also does like a mycotoxin type test, if I'm not mistaken, for ERMI. Yeah. Where
it breaks it up between like commonly found outdoor mold versus what's commonly found in a situation where you have mold growth inside of a built environment.
Right. One of the other things that's important with the VOCs is with spore sampling, like ERMI or any other type of spore sampling for molds, the aerosol cassettes or the swabs, those you can typically actually speciate. You can tell what mold it is, where you can indicate whether it's an outdoor or an indoor. VOCs aren't dependent based on the molds. There's not enough information that can correlate. If you see X chemical, X mold VOC, this is for sure this mold growing on this surface. And so you have some of that dynamic variables, unfortunately, that says if that kind of mold is growing on this kind of surface versus that kind of surface versus that one, or what's the humidity typically at? Is it a higher humidity? Is it a moderate humidity? They'll give off different chemical compounds. So the VOC portion can't necessarily use to identify the type of mold.
Okay. Now, I know in the past, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you also offer like a tape test, a tape dust test.
We do, yeah. So with an affiliate lab of ours, we offer essentially a bioslide, a microscope slide, surface dust collection. That test itself does actually identify mold spores as well as other types of particles. So whether it's fibers, skin cells, insect parts, whatever you might find in a dust, essentially. Okay. So that one does include the mold.
And that's great too if you are, again, you're looking at evaluating what type of air purification system to install into your home so you know what you're dealing with. Question I get all the time, not only for air but also for water, is what filter should I buy? And it's really helpful to know what we're dealing with so we can recommend the correct unit for the right situation, and that tape test would be helpful. So I don't know if there's any other questions regarding mold and VOCs or formaldehyde, but what I would like to get some information on, because I've seen it on your website and it's being talked about more, is the ability to test for PFAS chemicals, the forever chemicals. Is that something that you offer for a home service, or is that more professional only?
At this point, PFAS testing across the country as a whole, as more and more states become a requirement. So we're in Michigan. Michigan is a state that requires the testing for it at this point. If you're submitting for state information, like as a municipality or a city doing so, cost of analysis, and that's something that we can do. You're looking upwards of $300 to $600 a test. Okay. Depends on how many of those PFAS compounds you need to look for. It's pretty complex, very similar to VOCs. We do have an option, if desired, for residential customers. It is not quite to the level of detail, like scrutiny or certification, I guess you would say, the quality assurance detail of like a test for a municipality, but we have kind of a lower cost analysis option that looks for just PFOS and PFOA. So just those two components, and gives a concentration as to whether or not it's up and above 70 ppt. Now, the EPA came out with a number of different concentrations that really brings that level down. When we originally put it together, that 70 ppt was kind of what the EPA had, and that's what the basis point was. Now, with states coming down into, say, 4 ppt or part per trillion, we're getting much, much below that. And so with that quality assurance and those extra controls are required. And that's where Our survey or summary type test, similar to our VOC one, was at about $150. But now at this point, that test doesn't really do a whole lot of good because you're not getting those low concentrations. So typically then what you're looking for is one of those much more costly analysis options where they've got a couple of larger bottles, 250 milliliter bottles that would be collected with a what's that called? Preservative. Sorry, there's a small preservative. I was trying to think of what it was called. There's a small, as a solvent is what I was going to say, but inside that bottle, there's a small preservative essentially that's included in it as to when you and how you would collect that. I do think we do have through the Enthalpy network a way to do that larger analysis option direct to consumer, and I can get your listeners and you that link.
Do you think this is something that's going to become more popular in years to come? You know, I just think that we've gone from really hearing nothing about these chemicals to what we know today in just a blink of an eye, it seems. And, you know, we're, as somebody, a professional in the industry, I'm always looking for what is that next thing. You know, we had lead, we had asbestos. I think right now we're in the midst of mold and formaldehyde as being the big issues, but these forever chemicals now, it's just all of a sudden it's just exploding in research and articles and so forth. I imagine it's going to be a matter of time before this becomes more of a normal test that somebody would want to do in their home.
I think so too. I think it's certainly coming more to the residential space. That's where you're concerned. That's why municipalities are really doing their drinking water testing, right? To make sure that they're not introducing or exposing the population to that. Now that begs another point. Some people are not necessarily on municipal water, but in well water. Even well water has some concerns. The biggest difficulty with PFAS is that it was used in so many different things. So some of the research that's out there in terms of what we've seen in Michigan, you know, they're indicating to us to be mindful of fish because it bioaccumulates. So it builds up in your system. It's kind of like the mercury in fish process, right? But they've also found and done tissue from, say, turkey and deer when you hunt. And so it's building up in some of those things too. And the reason it's building up in those is that it's part of the natural water system in a lot of locations. And it's in the soil, which is being uptake into the plant life that these creatures are eating. And so that's the expectation is that even in rural areas where you have well water systems, if there's agriculture around, you may have something that had a wastewater sludge treatment, something similar kind of spread across the agriculture. So there's a bit of concern it's pretty much everywhere that they can look for it. It's a difficult one though, because it's a long-term buildup and you pretty much can't get away from it. So like tobacco smoke, like formaldehyde, we can't really get fully away from it. We can limit our exposure as much as possible. Yes. And that's kind of where we're at. They do assume that it has some carcinogenic natures. They don't have that, I don't think, in full proof in terms of the research because it just started, right? And some of our looking at those things. So that needs some more time and years to really understand the specific health impacts. One thing I do know, it is being looked at in the soil, the water. It's being looked at in milk, so bovine milk, you know, cow milk, in the meats and things that we eat. It's also being looked at in, say, mom's breast milk and things as to whether or not that crosses that path from the mother to the fetus. There is a bit of research out there that one of the biggest issues with PFAS exposures is that it does impact fetal development. And so with that, that's one of the larger concerns, of course, you know, if you have a high exposure as a female.
Sure.
But yeah, and limiting as much as we possibly can. It isn't just the water we drink or the food. It also, of course, is coming from some of those other things like our pans, our food packaging, right? So when we go to get a burger, they use a PFAS coating on some of those papers so that it doesn't become saturated with that oil, right? So that we can eat it in an appropriate way before it falls apart essentially. And so I think it's going to be a very long hill battle. I don't think we'll get rid of PFAS in a lot of consumer products for quite some time. There are some leaps and bounds that a number of companies that are on the hot seat right now are making, but it'll be some time before we're fully rid of it. But yes, I do think that concern is growing for sure.
Certainly. We had a guest on the show just about a month ago talking about these high-performance fabrics, the clothing that we wear, and all of these forever chemicals that are used in this clothing to make it wrinkle-resistant, stain-resistant, and so forth. I mean, all these things that are supposed to make our lives easier, you have to wonder, is it really better? And so, with my clients, one of the things I will stress is it's impossible to live in a home that is perfect. It's impossible to eat perfectly, to do everything correctly. You have to choose your battles, and you have to strive for tolerance, for reduction of chemical exposure, but don't strive for perfection, because that will never happen.
You'll end up disappointed.
Yeah. My line is, you'll either end up in the poorhouse or the nut house, one of the two.
Very accurately stated.
One more thing I want to touch on quickly, because this is something that customers have brought up in the past, is you do offer a test as well for tobacco smoke.
We do, yeah.
Okay. How does that work?
So essentially it uses the same VOC tube that we have. That sample tube is then collected in the space. We determine the chemical compounds from that. It is not just the VOCs themselves that we look for, but we have 3 specific chemical markers that we're looking for. Those 3 chemical markers are indicative of smoke, tobacco smoke and cigar smoke. They come from more of the plant and the leaf part. It's 3 different analyses. It's kind of a presence absence, or 3 different analytes, presence absence. It is a bit tricky. Tobacco smoke in itself, and one of the caveats that we have to indicate is that usually that complaint and request comes from somebody that's living in a multi-tenant situation. They're in a townhouse, or duplex or apartment. And with that, the tobacco smoke itself is primarily particles. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that filters out, and we're looking for the small little bits of chemicals that might be present. So it can be very hard to actually get a positive, because we're looking at like a 1% of that total smoke amount is what we're looking for. The other thing is, our noses are amazing. We were creatively made and wonderfully made, and we can smell it way before instrumentation can even see it.
Okay.
And so we don't want to say that you're not right, but that chemically speaking, in terms of the instrumentation, it's just we can't necessarily see it. But that does help when you're going or in a complaint and a concern with a neighboring tenant, right. Or if you're a property management, where you have those spaces.
Right. And we've seen situations where people buy a home or buy a condo, and they want to do some renovation, but after being in there for a week or two, they can just notice that all of a sudden this smoke smell is starting to emanate back into the house. What people don't normally realize is that when you paint just traditional paint over a surface that had been saturated with tobacco smoke, the water in the paint essentially re-emulsifies that smoke smell. And it may seal it up for a period of time, just because now you've got competing odors in the air. But after that paint smell is gone, it's fully cured, usually that tobacco smoke comes right back.
It does. And another part of that too is that paint is great. It is a coating, don't get me wrong. But with time, those coatings start to degrade.
Yeah.
So even if you essentially, like you said, you've bought yourself time, you haven't rid of the source.
Right. Now, so that's very good information. And folks, if anybody's listening is interested in this test, we don't currently have it on the website right now, but this is something that we could take care of over the phone or with a consultation. Any test that is offered, we have access to providing. Honestly, the 3 tests that you do right now, the mold, VOCs, and formaldehyde, have just been fantastic for the information that's derived from it, and usually help out 95% of our customers. So those more detailed tests are done really on an as-needed basis.
That is the benefit of the test. Doing them for so many years, doing them for so many different locations, we see the trends, right? As you know, Andrew, as you see so many of them, you really start to kind of pick up and can really help the client understand what's going on in the space. Again, covering about 70% of what could be in an indoor air environment causing the issues. And we're looking at it to say, is it high, low? Where do you sit kind of with normal indoor air spaces? And usually there's some sort of trigger there where we'll see an elevation, a spike that we can really kind of help direct the next steps for that remediation. So the removal and then airing or filtration processes as needed. And even if it's not the VOCs, then we've ruled out a large part of things. And so now we can start tackling some of the other analysis options, looking at the particles and other things.
Yeah, excellent point. And the last thing I'll point out there is that I see this as an invaluable asset for people who are in the green realty space, the healthy realtors. I started working with an organization, Wellness Real Estate, a while back, and this is perfect for what they are promoting because you've got clients and you've got the time. I know right now it's a little difficult if you were to go to put an offer on a home. So many people are putting offers on homes, not even contingent upon inspection anymore. But I've had clients over the years hire me to go through Zillow listings with them, and I'll look at all the corners. They'll even take a cell phone and do a FaceTime with me on the phone, and it usually comes down to saying, all right, well, it looks good now, but if you can get in there and conduct home air check, if the realtor allows, I think this might be a way to avert some crisis in the future. How long does it take to conduct the average VOC mold formaldehyde test?
So the actual collection process for the VOC and mold VOC, which is on one analysis, that is a 2 to 4 hour sample collection. So just a couple of hours is what we ask. The formaldehyde is a 20-minute to 30-minute sample collection. So 2.5 hours. If you're really in a time crunch, we can limit that by sending a couple of pumps to make it what you need. But it is a good tool just to see, is there anything hugely wrong here that I'm going to have to deal with, where you said like that tobacco smoke after you purchase a place, that it kind of comes back lingering a little bit later.
Sarah, thank you so much for coming today. We really appreciate it.